Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming out on a balmy January night here in North Carolina. My wife and I were talking about last week briefly. I told them they need to not turn the heat up in here and not have such comfortable chairs because I saw some people yawning. My own son was nodding off in the back, so anyway, I will try to keep your attention this evening. So glad that you all could be here this evening. For those that weren't here last week, I'll do a very, very quick review, and then we are going to get into things. Just a real quick housekeeping note. Behind the TV screen at the end, remind me to pull that away, but I have put my email address up here. So if anybody wants any of these notes, any of the slide presentations, anything at all, I am happy to send it to you. But instead of me sending around a list and you writing down in illegible writing your email address that I'll get wrong, I'll put mine up here. And if you just want to put in the subject line or something, Apologetics, I'll be happy to send that to you. So keep that in mind. All right. Well, for those that maybe were not here last week, very brief review. We are talking about apologetics. Apologetics is not how to say you're sorry. It is a defense of what you believe, or if you've taken some action, that you defend why you did that, or why you said that, why you believe something. That's what apologetics is. In my experience, I mentioned that I grew up in a Christian family. When the doors of the church were open, I was there, and I really felt like I got a good biblical education growing up through the church. But I didn't feel like, especially when I got to my teenage years and young adult years, that I had a lot of a basis for apologetics, knowing why I believed what I believed or what we believed. What was the basis for that? And one of the points I want to stress is you'll hear many people, I've heard this throughout my life, that Christians, you all just take things by faith. And that's true. We do take things by faith, but a lot of times it's more of a pejorative, they say that. It's like a blind faith, like you believe without any evidence, or despite the evidence, you believe something that just really doesn't have anything behind it. And what I'm trying to do here in these couple weeks, and certainly in my studies with apologetics, I would argue the opposite. There's a mountain of evidence that Christianity is true. It's not just by faith. I often will tell people, especially when I talk to the teenagers, that there is an element of faith. But I think you can take 99 steps out of 100, or maybe 95 or whatever it is, towards the end goal. The last step has to be faith. You do have to do that. But it's not blind faith. God gives you all this evidence to get to that point to begin with. So why do we study apologetics? First of all, for ourselves, for our own faith that we know that. And then also we looked at a verse in 1 Peter 3:15. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give a reason for the hope that you have. And then it ends by saying, but do this with gentleness and respect. We're not trying to win an argument. We're trying to get people into heaven because of the good news that God's given us is also available to them. So in our first session last week, we talked about atheism versus theism. What were the strengths or weaknesses of each of those positions? And we said that with atheism, which means that you believe that there is no God, among several things, but at least two logical conclusions you must come to. First of all, is that there is no right and wrong. There's no objective right and wrong. If there's no God, it's just might makes right, if enough people vote for it, or feelings. But there's no objective right and wrong. The other one was that there is no meaning to life. If there is no God, you live your years on this life and then back to dust, and it means nothing. Eat, drink, and be merry, do whatever you want, and because that's all there is, if there is no God. And we said that that does not correspond to reality, to our lived experiences. When we're hurt or injured, we don't think, well, that's just how it is. There's no such right and wrong. And the other thing is, like Pascal said, there's a vacuum-sized hole in everyone's heart that can only be filled by God. We feel like that there's something more we're here for, that it's not just this life. So those things don't correspond to reality. We then talked about revelation, and revelation just means to reveal. How does God reveal Himself? There are two main categories we looked at. One is general revelation, which just means it's available to everybody who's ever lived on the face of the earth. We looked, and those two things are creation. God talks about that in Romans chapter 1 in particular, or Paul does, excuse me, that creation, that it is evident that there is a God through creation. The second one was a conscience. We have this thing inside of us that says some things are right, some things are wrong. Where does that come from? If we have just evolved from nothing, why would we have a conscience? That points to God. The second category that we looked at, and we'll look at more this evening, is special or specific revelation. The two main categories there are the Bible, and we looked at that God has given us His written word through many authors, and we looked at the fact that the Bible is reliable. And in fact, I'm going to take a very quick detour. I just happened to read this on the Christian Post a couple days ago. Does anybody know who Joyce Carol Oates is? She's a famous author that nobody knows of either. I hadn't heard of her. But she was on, you've heard of?
I was an English major, you can't escape.
English major, so you know who she is. Okay. I just happened to note this. It says here in a January 11th post, which would have been just a few days ago, on X, author Joyce Carol Oates responded to podcast co-host Sam Adler-Bell's suggestion that she needs to read the Bible by declaring, quote, "The Bible, as you call it, is a work of fiction, or rather, it's an anthology of fictions." And remember, we looked at that. That's a common theme that people will tell you when they talk about the Bible, that it's just made up. It's not what the authors actually wrote. It's an embellishment of that from the copies we have. But we looked at the evidence that what you have in your hands in the Bible is what the authors actually wrote. Now, whether you believe that or not is a different story, but what we have in our hands is what the authors actually wrote. The last category of specific revelation, or the second of the two, that we had the Bible first, the second one is Jesus. God coming to earth as man. And so we're going to focus on that in our first session tonight, and then we're going to look at a very specific, very important event, the resurrection, in the second one. And then if there's enough time, I've got a few concluding remarks to make, and I'd be happy to take any questions, again, if we have some time on that. So, with that, let's look at Jesus. Who was or is He? And I'm going to read one other thing here. This is from a few years ago that I've got here. This is a little article about a pastor at a Baptist church in Harlem. And let me read this real quickly. Pastor Michael Walrund has grown First Corinthian Baptist Church in Harlem from 350 members to over 10,000 in the last 14 years. And here's what he said in a sermon from, again, 3 or 4 years ago. Quote, "There was a time when you could see people in the pulpit say, if you don't believe in Jesus, you're going to hell. But that's insanity in many ways, because that is not what Jesus even believed." Pastor Walrund indicated he doesn't want to exclude anybody, and here's what he said in conclusion. "The key is, do you believe in God? And whatever your path is to God, I celebrate that. Personally, I celebrate that." End quote. So, are there many paths to God? Let's take a look at what the Bible actually says. Who was or is Jesus? What do people say about Jesus? Who do they say He was? Anybody? I'm asking that to the crowd. Anybody hear anybody talk about Jesus? What do they say? What's that?
Nice guy.
Nice guy. Yeah, really nice guy.
Good teacher.
Good teacher. Prophet. Anyone else? You guys are hitting all the good ones. That's essentially it. Many people will say, yes, He was a great man. He was even a prophet. He had a lot of good things. He was trying to be helpful, and et cetera on that. That's what you'll usually hear from people in our culture, is that He was a good person. But then when you ask them about, well, was He really God? That's where a lot of people say, I can't agree with that. If you were God and you wanted to tell or communicate with or warn humans about something, what might be the best way to do that? Josh McDowell gives an analogy that if you were looking at an ant hill, a colony of ants, and you saw that there was a big flood of water that was coming their way, and you wanted to warn them, to tell them, hey, there's some water, you're going to get flooded, you need to get out of here, what would be the best way to do that? Well, his answer is, well, if you had the ability to become an ant, you could go and you could talk ant language, you'd be like the ants. If you were one of them, that'd be the best way that you could communicate that to him. Well, if God came to earth or had a spokesperson on earth, what might he or she be like? What would authenticate that that person indeed was from God? Well, number one, you would expect that there would be an unusual entrance. There would be something unusual or dramatic about the entrance. Perhaps a miraculous virgin birth. The Bible, and interestingly, the Quran, acknowledged that Jesus was virgin born and begotten of God. Number two, you would expect that this person that would be a spokesperson for God to be without sin or fault. The disciples said that Jesus was without sin. The crowd said that. The robber on the cross said that. Pilate, who condemned Jesus to crucifixion, said, "I find no fault in this man." The centurion at the crucifixion said that. And interestingly, the Quran even says that Jesus was without fault. Number three, you might expect that this person would be able to do the supernatural, or what we call miracles. We talked a little bit about miracles and so forth last week, so I won't rehash that. But you'd expect this person to perform miracles. Well, here is a list of the miracles that Jesus performed in the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I think I got most of them on there, but if not, you can see that he at least people claimed that he performed many miracles. Number four, you would expect that this person would have an acute sense of difference from other men. Well, here's what some friendly voices had to say. I remember first reading this like, how did they get a quote from Napoleon in an apologetics course? But here you go. Here's what Napoleon Bonaparte had to say. "I know men, and I tell you that Jesus Christ is no mere man. Between him and every other person in the world, there is no possible term of comparison. Alexander, Caesar, Charlemagne, and I have founded empires. But on what did we rest the creations of our genius? Upon force. Jesus Christ founded his empire upon love, and at this hour, millions of men would die for him." You would also, in this category of an acute sense of difference from other men, would look at, well, what would his enemies say? And I use enemies just in a general sense of people that do not believe in Jesus, are not Christians, were antithetical to that or didn't believe it. But let's look at a couple of famous people who had some things to say about Jesus. Wolfgang Goethe, if I'm saying that right. I'm not a German specialist, but here's what he said. "If ever the divine appeared on earth, it was in the person of Christ." And remember, he didn't ultimately believe in Christianity. What about Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a French philosopher in the Enlightenment? Here's what he said. "Can the person whose history the Gospels relate be himself a man? What sweetness, what purity in his manners, what affecting goodness in his instructions, what sublimity in his maxims, what profound wisdom in his discourses, what presence of mind, what ingenuity of justice in his replies. Yes, if the life and death of Socrates are those of a philosopher, the life and death of Jesus Christ are those of a God." So here's a guy, wouldn't even claim to be a Christian, who said those words. Number five, if there was a spokesperson for God that ever came to this earth, you might also expect that his or her words would be the greatest ever spoken. Here's what Bernard Ram, who is an author and professor of theology at Eastern Baptist Theological Seminary. Now, these are probably old, so I don't know if he's still there. But here's what he says. "Statistically speaking, the Gospels are the greatest literature ever written. They are read by more people, quoted by more authors, translated into more tongues, represented in more art, set to more music than any other book or books written by any man in any century in any land. But the words of Christ are not great on the grounds that they have such a statistical edge over anybody else's words. They are read more, quoted more, loved more, believed more, and translated more because they are the greatest words ever spoken. And where is their greatness? Their greatness lies in the pure, lucid spirituality in dealing clearly, definitively, and authoritatively with the greatest problems that throb in the human breast." Number six, you might expect this spokesperson for God to have a lasting and universal influence. Here's what Kenneth Scott Latourette, a famous former Yale historian, had to say about this. "As the centuries pass, the evidence is accumulating that, measured by his effect on history, Jesus is the most influential life ever lived on this planet." I think you could make a pretty good case for that. Number 7, you would expect that this person could satisfy the spiritual hunger of people on this earth. And we know that thousands or millions of people would give their testimony. I'm sure many, if not all of us in here, that indeed is the case, that Jesus has satisfied our spiritual hunger. And number 8, you might expect this person to have power over death. And of course, we're going to talk about that in the next section about the resurrection. So those would be things that you might expect to see from a spokesperson that God would send to this earth. And of course, we know that we see those things in Jesus. Jesus fulfilled all of these qualities, but not only that, Jesus himself made claims to deity. Here's what Thomas Schultz had to say about this. Not one recognized religious leader, not Moses, Paul, Buddha, Muhammad, Confucius, etc., has ever claimed to be God, that is, with the exception of Jesus Christ. Christ is the only religious leader who has ever claimed to be deity and the only individual ever who has convinced a great portion of the world that he is God. I had a conversation many years ago with somebody who said, well, you know, the guy on the psych ward down there says that he's God and that God sent him and that he's Jesus. Why don't you believe him? And the point is that, yeah, he may say that, but how many people did he convince that he was that? 0, whereas Jesus had millions of people that he convinced he indeed was the Messiah. And as an aside, quote, unique among trials, not the actions, but the identity of the accused was on trial when Jesus went on trial. Think about that. For most people, you go on trial for something that you did. He was on trial for whether he was the Messiah or not. That was the whole purpose of his trial. Well, unbelievably, many people say that Jesus never claimed to be God. He was a prophet, he was a good person, but he never claimed to be God. So, let's nip that in the bud here. He had some direct claims and he had some indirect claims. First of all, the direct claims to being the Messiah. This is in Mark chapter 14. This was when he was before the Sanhedrin and they were deciding what they were going to do with him. But he remained silent and made no answer. Again, the high priest asked him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" And Jesus said, "I am." There's a loaded phrase as well. "And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." And the high priest tore his garments and said, "What further witnesses do we need? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your decision?" And they all condemned him as deserving death. You'll notice here that Jesus used 3 titles used in the Old Testament for the Messiah, or God. Son of the Blessed, sitting at the right hands of power, and the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven. I think they're all from Isaiah. I should have gotten that reference. But his enemies knew quite clearly what he was saying. You notice that as soon as he said that, they knew what he was claiming. Here's what Robert Anderson has to say about this. "But no confirmatory evidence is more convincing than that of hostile witnesses. And the fact that the Lord laid claim to deity is incontestably established by the actions of his enemies. We must remember that the Jews were not a tribe of ignorant savages, but a highly cultured and intensely religious people. And it was upon this very charge that without a dissentient voice, his death was decreed by the Sanhedrin." They knew exactly what he was claiming when he said that. Jesus also claimed equality with the Father. Now, if he wasn't truly deity or the Messiah, that was blasphemy. But he certainly did say that he was equal with the Father. I've got some folks who have agreed to read some verses, so we will get these out rapid fire. Who's got John 10, 30 through 33? Josh, go ahead.
"I and the Father are one." Again the Jews picked up rocks to stone him. Jesus replied, "I have shown you many good works from the Father. For which of these works are you stoning me?" "We aren't stoning you for a good work," the Jews answered, "but for blasphemy, because you, being a man, make yourself God."
Right there, he says it there. What about John 5, 17 through 18?
Jesus responded to them, "My Father is still working, and I am working also." This is why the Jews began trying all the more to kill him. Not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal to God.
Excellent. Very good. Thank you all for doing this. And John chapter 8, 58, 59.
Jesus answered, "I tell you the truth, before Abraham was even born, I am. At that point, they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus was hidden from them and left the temple.
Great. He's claiming that he, even before Abraham, he existed. I am, exactly, yeah. And that's something that when the Jews ask, God, who are you? Yahweh replied, I am. And here's Jesus saying the same thing. So very good. He also claimed that he was the only way to the Father or to heaven. Remember what I read about this person who said, whatever path you have, I celebrate that. That's great. What did Jesus have to say about this in John chapter 14:6?
Jesus answered, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me.
That's pretty exclusive, don't you think? He doesn't leave a whole lot of room for other paths to heaven. He said, I am it. Thank you all for reading those. Next, Jesus received and accepted worship, which in Jewish culture that was only reserved for Yahweh. The leper did that. The man born blind in John chapter 9. The disciples worshiped Jesus. And we talked about doubting Thomas, who when he finally saw the risen Savior, he said, my God, my Lord and my God. So he accepted that worship, which only God was allowed to do. Well, let's look at his indirect claims very briefly as well. I'm not going to read this passage, but if you remember Mark chapter 2, verses 5 through 12, there was a young man who was lame, couldn't walk, and his friends, and he heard that Jesus was coming into town. Jesus was in a house, and they couldn't get in because it was so packed in there. So they went up on the roof, and they took off some tiles on the roof, and they lowered him down there. And what was interesting about this story was, which did Jesus say first? Your sins are forgiven, or I'm going to heal you. Do you remember? He said, your sins are forgiven. And it says in that passage that the people around them, especially those who were religious leaders, wondered in their mind, like, wait a minute, only God can forgive sins. What's he talking about? And then Jesus said, so that you know that I am God. And again, I'm paraphrasing. I'm going to go ahead and heal this man so that you know that I have authority to forgive sins. Jesus also accepted titles such as Yahweh, Son of God, Son of Man, and Son of the Blessed, all terms of God and of a deity. The last thing I'm going to look at here in this session are some prophecies that were fulfilled by Jesus. There are over 300 Old Testament messianic prophecies. There we go. And 61 of those are listed in Evidence That Demands a Verdict, which is a Josh McDowell book, which I've got here, with the prophecy and the fulfillment. Here's the verse where it says the prophecy. Here's the fulfillment in the New Testament through Jesus. Well, there are some objections when people hear this. One is they say that, well, these were actually written after the time of Jesus. In other words, what they're saying is that Jesus did something. Somebody, 10 years later, his disciples wrote down, oh, I'm going to prophesy that Jesus is going to do this in this year, and tried to pass it off as if they had written that 100 years ago or 50 years ago. Well, there's no evidence to support that, and there's much evidence to contradict that these were written after the time of Jesus. Number two, that they're deliberate and too easy to fulfill, such as saying, I believe the sun will come up tomorrow morning. That's a pretty easy one that I could make that I'm pretty confident will happen, although not for sure, but pretty confident. But many of these prophecies were beyond human control. Where you were born. Anybody able to decide where you were born? I don't think so. He came from the line of David. That's not just something that's very easy to do. So many of these prophecies were not something that could be controlled by humans. The third one is that just sheer accident or coincidence. From my reading, I think there have roughly, people have figured out, been about 14 billion people who have lived on the face of the earth at one point or another. And just by accident, somebody is going to meet some of these prophecies just by sheer chance. Well, a gentleman named Peter Stoner wrote a book entitled Science Speaks that was reviewed and approved by the American Scientific Affiliation. And he calculated the odds of one man fulfilling 8 specific prophecies, 8 of these 300 prophecies. He looked at them and did a statistical analysis about what would the odds of somebody fulfilling each one of these prophecies, or each of these 8 prophecies. And he came up with a chance of 1 in 10 to the 17th Now, if we've got any math people out there, I believe this is 1 in 100 quadrillion. Am I right? All right, I didn't think so. I was going to say, all right, I can say whatever I want. No one will know the difference, right? Again, there are only about 14 billion people that have lived on the face of the earth. This is way more than that. Statistically, it's just not going to happen. But just in case, he went ahead and looked at 40 more for a total of 48 specific prophecies, did his best to get the statistical odds of what that would be for one person to fulfill that. And he came up with 1 in 10 to the 157th power, which looks like that. Count them up. All right? Are there 157 zeros there? So the odds that that's going to happen just by sheer chance, it's not. It is not going to happen. So here's our conclusion for this session by C.S. Lewis. I'm trying here to prevent anyone from saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is the one thing we must not say. A man who is merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic, on the level with a man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come up with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us, and he did not intend to. This is often summarized as the trilemma, that Jesus was either Lord, liar, or lunatic. Now, I've had other people add on legend, meaning that he never existed, but that's just crazy talk. But that's the trilemma, Lord, liar, lunatic. Those are your only logical choices for Jesus. He can't be just a good guy, a prophet, a good teacher. It's one of those three things. All right. Next, we are going to move into our last official session, and we are going to look at the resurrection of Jesus. Was it fact or fiction? I often ask with this a couple of questions. And this is kind of a crazy question because it's not a good one, but I'll ask it anyway. Which is more important to Christianity, Jesus dying on the cross or his resurrection? Now again, I know they're both important, but anybody want to try that one? A resurrection. Why? That's exactly right. That's the way I look at it as well. Many people were crucified, but only one person rose under his own power from the dead. My next question that I often ask people is this, and there is a right or wrong answer on this one, I believe, from the Bible. If they could go into Jerusalem and they found a tomb and they found some bones and they were able to extract the DNA and they were able to conclusively prove with DNA that these were Jesus' bones, that he was dead, that he never rose from the grave, would that make a difference in your faith or not? It absolutely would make a difference. And we'll get into that here in just a minute. Here's what Paul said about this possibility. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile. You are still in your sins. Then those also who have fallen asleep in Christ are lost. If only for this life we have hope in Christ, we are to be pitied more than all men. We believe a delusion if Jesus didn't rise from the dead. Here's what John Locke, the famous John Locke, said about this. Our Savior's resurrection is truly of great importance in Christianity, so great that his being or not being the Messiah stands or falls with it, so that these two important articles are inseparable and in effect make one. For since that time, believe one and you believe both. Deny one of them and you can believe neither. Basically what he's saying here is, if Jesus rose from the dead, then he was the Messiah. The Bible is true. There is a God. Your life has purpose, meaning, and significance. And one day you will either go to heaven or hell. If Jesus did not rise from the dead, he was not the Messiah. The Bible is not true. There is no God of the Bible. Your life is meaningless. It has nothing. When you die, you're going to go back to the ground, and that's it. So this idea or this issue of whether Jesus rose from the dead or not, everything else hinges on this. Here's what Wilbur Smith had to say about this as we look more into this matter. The meaning of the resurrection is a theological matter, but the fact of the resurrection is a historical matter. The nature of the resurrection body of Jesus may be a mystery, but the fact that the body disappeared from the tomb is a matter to be decided upon by historical evidence. So the meaning is one thing, but if we're going to look at did this actually happen, we're going to look at the what I would call historical/legal way of looking at things. I get this all the time as a physician being in the science realm. I'll talk about the resurrection or we'll get on these topics and people will say, well, prove it. And what they're asking for is a scientific experiment to prove it. You can't scientifically prove that you had lunch today or that you woke up this morning. It's a historical/legal eyewitness thing. It's not something that can be repeated in a scientific experiment. So keep that in mind as well. Okay, so if you would turn in your Bibles with me to Matthew chapter 27, we're going to read verses 57 through 66. And I will get to these pictures in just a minute. There we go. All right, we're going to read the pre-resurrection account. And I'm going to go ahead and read this in Matthew chapter 27, verses 57 through 66, if you want to follow along, or you can just listen here. And again, remember, this is the pre-resurrection account. As evening approached, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who had himself become a disciple of Jesus. Going to Pilate, he asked for Jesus' body, and Pilate ordered that it be given to him. Joseph took the body, wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, and placed it in his own new tomb that he had cut out of the rock. He rolled a big stone in front of the entrance to the tomb and went away. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were sitting there opposite the tomb. The next day, the one after preparation day, the chief priests and the Pharisees went to Pilate. Sir, they said, we remember that while he was still alive, that deceiver said, after 3 days I will rise again. So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the 3rd day. Otherwise, his disciples may come and steal the body and tell the people that he has been raised from the dead. This last deception will be worse than the first. Take a guard, Pilate answered. Go, make the tomb as secure as you know how. So they went and made the tomb secure by putting a seal on the stone and posting the guard. Well, let me show you some pictures. And I'm sorry this is going to look like shameless self-promotion, but my grandmother told me that she always said when you take pictures, always have a person in the picture, because when you go and look back at them, you won't care if nobody's in the picture, but if a person's in there, you'll do that. And I found that to be true. So anyway, ignore the people in here. This was from a few years ago as well. There's actually, if you go to Jerusalem, there's a bit of a dispute about where Jesus was buried. In fact, we don't know for sure at all, but there are 2 main sites. One thing I just want to point out here is I'm going to show you some pictures from one that we went to. We saw both of them, but the other one is very similar in the key points that I'm going to make here. So, first of all, if you'll look off in the distance, I believe that's Wally Schamberger there at the entrance to the tomb. You will see that the first thing is that this was a rock. There was a giant rock. There was one opening into this. There was no back door, hidden entrance, or trap door to get in or out of this place. That's the first thing. The second thing that we see, that we read here, is that a stone was rolled in front of the entrance. This was a common practice to keep both man and beast out of there. The average weight of a stone was around 4,000 pounds, 2 tons. So this was a big one, and it was usually put into place by a series of levers requiring several people to get it into place. And let me ask you this. If Jesus said, I'm going to rise from the dead in 3 days, and everybody knew this, and they were going to make this tomb secure, do you think that the stone on average would be smaller than average or larger than average? My guess is it's at least going to be normal, if not a little bit bigger than the average one that they put in there. So think about that, even maybe greater than 4,000 pounds. Next, we see that Jesus was, and not in this passage, we see that Jesus was wrapped in essentially some linen cloths that were placed in a gummy aromatic substance and wrapped up. Anybody had a plaster cast on before or know what I'm talking about? They put it on and eventually hardened. So think of an entire full body cast that you're in. And by the way, could you get out of one of these things once they've hardened by yourself? It wouldn't happen. Did I ask somebody to read John chapter 19, verses 39 through 40? Yes. Do you mind reading that? This is from John. This is one other little piece of the puzzle that Matthew doesn't note, but go ahead and read that.
Nicodemus, who had first come to him by night, also came bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100 pounds weight. So they took the body of Jesus and bound it in linen wrappings with the spices, as is the burial custom of the Jews.
So a plaster cast, and how much did it say it weighed? 100 pounds. Okay, this was, you're not getting out of this one very easily. So we see that. The fourth thing that we see here described in Matthew is that a seal was placed across the entrance to the tomb. So what they did was they put the stone in front of it first, and then what they would do in the presence of the Roman guards, which we'll get to in just a minute, they put a leather strap from one end of the tomb or the entrance to the other. And they would get wax and they would put it on there and they would put the official Roman seal on there. If that was broken, so if anybody moved the stone or came and pulled that off, there was a punishment for that. Anybody know what the punishment was for breaking the Roman seal once it was there?
Yeah.
Automatic death, automatic crucifixion typically is what happened. So you would not want to break that. And then the last thing, I'm sorry, I had a few other pictures here. So there's the entrance. As you can see, there's no back door here. It was a solid tomb. And there we go. So the last thing we're going to talk about are the guards. It says that go ahead and place a guard there. Now, when you read this in English, it sounds like there was one lone guy that was there from midnight to 6 a.m. A guard actually in the Greek means typically 4 soldiers. So they say place a guard of soldiers there. It could mean 8, 4 to 8, but it's more than just one guard that was there. Anybody know anything about the Roman army? Usually considered pretty good fighting force or not too hot? Strongest at the time. And in fact, if you read some military historians, many of them will say that if you take into context the time and the technology, that the Roman army was the greatest fighting force that the world has ever seen. These were professional soldiers, that's all they did, and they had some pretty good motivation to do a decent job. Here is what Polybius, he was a Roman military historian, had to say about a few things about Roman soldiers. Here were some offenses that were punishable by death: desertion, losing or disposing of one's arms. Whew, you would keep track of things there. Insulting a general, wounding a fellow soldier with a sword, disabling self, or attempting suicide without reasonable excuse. Okay? If it was reasonable, that's fine. But if it was unreasonable, we're going to go ahead and finish the job, is what they said. Leaving the night watch, breaking the centurion's staff or striking him when being punished, escaping the guardhouse, disturbing the peace. Other punishments that I read about that he talked about, one time they punished somebody by burning his shirt upon him as a warning to others. I was watching the History Channel, this was probably about 10 years ago, and they were talking about, I believe it was Spartacus, who got a ragtag army of people, and he went up against a Roman legion and actually won, which was kind of unheard of at the time. And they had a punishment for the Roman soldiers after they got them all back together called decimation. Who knows in the metric system what deci means? Does anybody know what? It means 1/10. What they did to the Roman soldiers after this loss was a Roman legion was typically comprised of about 6,000 soldiers, I believe. They put them in 600 groups of 10 each, and they either drew straws or cast lots or something. And the guy who got the short straw, guess what the other 9 had to do to him? Kill him. That's exactly right. That's where we get the word decimation. That's pretty good motivation the next time they're in battle, that they don't want to lose because they might be the 1 out of 10 if they do this again. And here's what Polybius said as an encapsulation. The fear of punishments produced faultless attention to duty, especially in the night watches. Here's what E. Licamus said. Never had a criminal given so much worry after his execution. Above all, never had a crucified man had the honor of being guarded by a squad of soldiers. And what's interesting is how God worked this out. Is imagine if they had executed Jesus, put him in a tomb, and everybody left. And then 3 days later, his body would have been gone. Everyone would have said, well, the disciples stole it, something happened. But by actually having the guards there and going to all these preparations, it was God's plan to prove that indeed he rose from the dead. All right. If you would turn with me, I'm going to read now John chapter 20, verses 1 through 9. And we are going to look at the post-resurrection account, what we see after the resurrection on Sunday morning. So let me read this fairly quickly. John chapter 20, verses 1 through 9. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, which was John, by the way. He didn't refer to himself for whatever reason, and said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him." So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter, who was behind him, arrived and went into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the burial cloth that had been around Jesus' head. The cloth was folded up by itself, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple, who had reached the tomb first, also went inside. He saw and believed. And in parentheses in verse 9 it says, they still did not understand from Scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. So, let's look at this post-resurrection account. The first thing that you'll notice is that the tomb was empty and the stone was rolled away. Here's what Frank Morrison had to say about this. In all the fragments and echoes of this far-off controversy which have come down to us, we are nowhere told that any responsible person asserted that the body of Jesus was still in the tomb. Running all through these ancient documents is the persistent assumption that the tomb of Christ was vacant. Paul Alpha said this, "The situation demands that within the circle of the first community, one had a reliable testimony for the fact that the grave had been found empty. The resurrection could have not been maintained in Jerusalem for a single day, for a single hour, if the emptiness of the tomb had not been established as a fact for all concerned." And even his enemies admitted that indeed the tomb was empty. Who has Matthew chapter 28, verses 11 through 15? Mike, if you can read that for us. This is what Matthew relates to us that happened with the guards on that Sunday morning.
Now while they were going, behold, some of the guard came into the city and reported to the chief priest all the things that had happened. When they had assembled with the elders and consulted together, they gave a large sum of money to the soldiers, saying, "Tell them his disciples came at night and stole him away while we slept. And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will appease him and make you secure." So they took the money and did as they were instructed, and this saying is commonly reported among the Jews until this day.
So the soldiers, the Roman soldiers, they went and reported this to, it wasn't the chief, some of the religious leaders. Now, what do you notice that's interesting? Did the religious leaders believe the guards? Did they say, we need to go check the tomb first? They knew that the Roman guards, under punishment of crucifixion, would not come and tell them this happened unless it really happened. And they concocted a story out of this. I'm sure the soldiers, first of all, were scared from the angels coming and moving the rock, but they were also scared that they were under the penalty of crucifixion for this. So, here's what Julius Wellhausen has to say. He is a famous German scholar noted for his criticism of Christianity and the Bible. Here's what he said. "It is admitted that with the resurrection, the body of Jesus also had vanished from the grave, and it will be impossible to account for this on natural grounds." He's basically, you can just see him saying, There's no other way to say this, but it supernaturally happened. I don't like it, but I have no other good explanation for this. The next thing that we look at in the post-resurrection account are the grave clothes. There was something about the grave clothes, if you remember, 100 pounds of basically a plaster cast, that really caught the attention of Simon Peter and John when they went in and looked at it. Here's what John Stott said. The question is, what did he, meaning Peter, see which made him believe? The story suggests that it was not just the story suggests that it was not just the absence of the body, but the presence of the grave clothes, and in particular, their undisturbed position. So think about that. You've got this plaster cast on, and it's still sitting there perfectly intact with the headpiece right where it was. How does that happen? When you get a cast off, they get out the cutting machine and take it off, and it's ripped all over the place. But when they looked and they saw that the grave clothes were there, but Jesus was not in this plaster cast, they knew that this was a miracle. The third thing that we look at is that the seal was broken. What was the punishment for that for the soldiers when the seal was broken? Crucifixion. And that this type of thing was always punished by death. Who's got Acts chapter 12, verse 19? Okay, and before you read Acts chapter 12, verse 19, this is when, if you remember, Peter was in jail. There was an earthquake, and the gates came open, and Peter left the prison. Okay? And let's see what happened to the guards the next morning when Herod, who was the governor, found out about this.
And after Herod searched for him and did not find him, he examined the sentries and ordered that they should be put to death. Then he went down from Judea to Caesarea and spent time there.
So you see what happened to the guards when Peter got out from an earthquake. They were executed. The last thing that we're going to look at here is the eyewitness appearances of Jesus to over 500 people. Who's got 1 Corinthians 15, 5 through 6?
It says, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. After that he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom remain until now, but some have fallen asleep.
Very good. So he appeared to several people, and then a totality of over 500 people. Here's what John Warwick Montgomery, who's a professor or former professor and chairman of the Division of Church History and Christian Thought at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. He says this, note that when the disciples of Jesus proclaimed the resurrection, they did so as eyewitnesses, and they did so while people were still alive who had had contact with the events they spoke of. In 56 AD, Paul wrote that over 500 people had seen the risen Jesus and that most of them were still alive. It passes the ground of credibility that the early Christians could have manufactured such a tale and then preached it among those who might easily have refuted it by simply producing the body of Jesus. Let's talk a little bit about some theories that people come up with that they say disprove that Jesus rose from the dead. And while we look at these four major theories or objections to the fact that Jesus rose from the dead, here's what J.N. Anderson said. He is a well-known British attorney. He said this, a point which needs stressing is that the evidence must be considered as a whole. It is comparatively easy to find an alternative explanation for one or another of the different strands which make up this testimony. But such explanations are valueless unless they fit the other strands in the testimony as well. So when we look at these things, it's easy to maybe pick apart perhaps one small detail of the resurrection. But we've got to keep in mind that it's got to fit the entire story of the resurrection. So here are four of the main theories to disprove the resurrection. The first one is often called the swoon theory. Who's seen The Princess Bride? Okay? You know where he says in that movie that he's not dead, he's mostly dead. This is kind of what the swoon theory is. This is basically, Jesus was on the cross and it looked like he was dead. He was still breathing, but it was very shallow, and he was kind of slunk over like this, and he looked dead, but he wasn't. And they took him to the tomb, and he spent a few days in there, and it was kind of cool in there, and it kind of revived him. And then he hopped out of the plaster cast. He pushed away the 6,000-pound stone. He karate chopped a few Roman guards. He walked 2 miles to the disciples where they were sleeping and kicked open the door and said, "Hey, I'm back, guys. I'm still alive." That's the swoon theory. This one's not real plausible, okay? The Roman detachment that did crucifixions, that was their job. They were professionals at this. They were pretty good at being pretty sure that the person that was crucified was dead. And if you know anything about crucifixion, I won't go into all the details, it's fairly easy to tell when somebody from a crucifixion is dead. In order to breathe, they had to push themselves up in order to breathe. So once that stopped for a minute or two, they were dead. And just in case, they thrust a spear into his heart. Okay? So if he can survive that, good luck on that one. The next one is the theft theory. The theft theory says that the disciples, these guys who were mostly fishermen, they came in the middle of the night and they did some karate chops and they took down the Roman guards who, if they let this happen, were going to be crucified, remember. They moved the 6,000, 4,000 pound stone, broke the seal, took Jesus' body, and they took off with it. So that one's not too good either. The disciples, they didn't even know. Remember, it said that he was supposed to rise from the dead. That still hadn't registered with them. They were mostly fishermen, and you think they were going to overpower these guards. It's just not very plausible. And by the way, if this was not true, how could they have disproved this? Produce the body of Jesus, and that would immediately disprove this. The third one is the hallucination theory. This basically says that the 500 and so odd people that appeared to Jesus, or that Jesus appeared to, that he really didn't, that they all hallucinated at the same time about the same event. Now, fortunately or unfortunately, I had to take a 2-month rotation in psychiatry in medical school. And one of the things that we learned about people that had hallucinations, it was typically an individual would have a hallucination that would be about the same person or vision that they had over a long period of time. It was not for most people to have hallucinations during a very specific small amount of time, and 500 people didn't see the same hallucination at the same time either. That doesn't fit the bounds of this. And by the way, if everyone was hallucinating and said, Jesus is alive, what could the authorities have done to immediately disprove that? Produce the body, okay? They could say, nope, he's right here, we've got him here. The fourth one is the wrong tomb theory. This is basically that they went and they took a left on Maple Street instead of a right. And they magically went to another cemetery and tomb, and it was empty. No one was in there. And they said, hey, Jesus wasn't here, and he's risen from the dead. If that was true, that they took a wrong turn on Maple Street, what's one way that the authorities could have proved that that wasn't true? Produce the body, okay, if they still had it. But you notice none of those were the case. So the last thing here I want to look at on this topic, or the last couple things, I've listed here the 12 disciples and how they died, okay? Now, if you remember, the disciples, were they gung-ho when the authorities came for Jesus? Were they ready to fight the Romans and the soldiers and all this stuff? They scattered, okay? They were running in all kinds of directions, one of them naked. Peter denied Christ 3 times. They were scattered. They were not this big group of men that were ready to defend Jesus. They were scared, okay? And again, it says they didn't even quite understand that he had to rise from the dead. You'll notice on this list that many of the disciples were crucified, killed by the sword. One of them was stoned, a spear thrust. The only disciple that died of natural causes was John, the Apostle John. And I will remind you, John, although he died of natural causes, they believe he was about 80 to 90 years old. He was marooned, essentially, on the island of Patmos in the Aegean Sea, which is a small rocky island. That's where he got the revelation, where he got the visions from Revelation. But he died of natural causes. Everyone else died like this. Now think about this. There are a few possibilities if you were the disciples. One is that you knew Jesus had not risen from the dead. Total lie. Would you die for a lie? Would you be crucified for a lie that you knew was a lie? I don't think anybody I know of, I certainly wouldn't do that. The second possibility is that the disciples were 90% sure that Jesus rose from the dead. They thought that they saw him, and they're pretty sure, not completely. Would you die or go through crucifixion if you weren't 100% sure? I would even do that. The third possibility is the disciples, this group of men that were scared to death before the resurrection, suddenly became so convinced they changed the world and they were crucified, killed by the sword, etc. They were 100% sure that Jesus did rise from the dead. That to me is some of the best proof that Jesus indeed rose from the dead, that the disciples were willing to die because they were 100% sure that that's what happened. Yes, Paul.
Wasn't John boiled in oil and survived before he was exiled to Patmos?
I believe that's right, actually. You may be right on that one. So, he died of natural causes, right?
But that's a horrible...
Oh, yeah, that's my point. I mean, this was not easy. And even if he wasn't going to the island of Patmos, it was a penal colony. It was not all roses over there. Sir Lionel Luckhoo said this, "I humbly add, I have spent more than 42 years as a defense trial lawyer." He is a famous attorney, "appearing in many parts of the world, and I am still in active practice. I have been fortunate to secure a number of successes in jury trials, and I say unequivocally, the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ is so overwhelming that it compels acceptance by proof, which leaves absolutely no room for doubt." That's what he has to say about it. All right, I do have just a couple minutes, so I'm going to really quickly go through a few concluding slides on apologetics. And whenever I do this series, I end with this and then take some questions and get some comments. We'll see if we have a couple minutes. Here's what G.K. Chesterton said about apologetics and what we've looked at. "The problem with Christianity is not that it has been tried and found wanting, but that it has been found difficult and left untried." Truer words, I think, have not ever been spoken than that. Here's what John Stott says, "If then you suffer from moral anemia, take my advice and steer clear of Christianity. If you want to live a life of easygoing self-indulgence, whatever you do, do not become a Christian." And basically what I point out to people that I talk about, and again, I've mostly done this for teenagers over the past few years, is what Jesus says. You've got to count the cost if you want to become a Christian. I think of the parable that Jesus talks about, the pearl of great price. You're going to have to give up everything, but it's worth it. That pearl, meaning your salvation, is worth it. But you've got to count the cost. Aldous Huxley, remember I read a quote from him last week where he said that he didn't believe in God because he wanted to do his own thing, especially in the sexual realm? Here's what he says. "Most ignorance is vincible ignorance. We don't know because we don't want to know. It is our will that decides how and upon what subjects we shall use our intelligence. Those who detect no meaning in the world generally do so because, for one reason or another, it suits their books that the world should be meaningless." A couple other quick quotes here. Friedrich Nietzsche said, "All truth is bloody truth." Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who became a Christian in the Soviet Gulag, said, "1 ounce of truth outweighs the whole world." And of course, Jesus said, "The truth will set you free." C.S. Lewis, I read this earlier. He basically said the trilemma, Jesus is either Lord, liar, or lunatic. Simon Greenleaf, one of the greatest historians, said this, "You may choose to say I do not believe at all, but you may not say that there is not enough evidence to believe in Jesus and Christianity." And I will leave it at that one. Thank you all for your attention. I really appreciate that. Thank you.